My boyfriend didn't just dump me. He threw me away like a piece of trash right in front of his entire family. We were sitting at Thanksgiving dinner when I reached for a second helping of mashed potatoes, and he literally grabbed my wrist, pulled the plate away, and shouted, "Haven't you had enough? Look at yourself, Sarah. I'm tired of being the guy with the fat girlfriend that everyone pities." The room went dead silent, and as I sat there burning with shame, he stood up, grabbed his coat, and told me not to be there when he got back because he was done dating a human beanbag. I watched him walk out, realizing that while I had a weight problem, he had a soul problem. The bedroom was silent, except for the frantic, rhythmic sound of a zipper struggling against fabric. I gripped the edge of the dresser, my knuckles white, praying the red silk would just give an extra inch. This dress was Tyler's idea of a goal. He bought it 2 sizes too small for our anniversary, a shimmering, silent threat hanging in the back of the closet for months. Tonight was the deadline. I could hear him pacing in the hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing the heartbeat thumping in my ears. Every sigh he let out was a sharp blade, cutting through the door and stripping away my confidence before he even saw me. I finally managed to pull the fabric over my hips, but the reflection in the mirror was a stranger. My skin was flushed, a map of red marks tracing where the seams dug into my flesh. I was sweating, my breath coming in shallow hitches, panicked that the slightest movement would send the delicate silk flying apart. I looked at my face and saw a woman who looked exhausted. Not from the effort of dressing, but from the years of trying to be small enough to fit into a man's narrow definition of beauty. The door creaked open. Tyler didn't walk in, he loomed. He leaned against the frame, adjusted his expensive watch, and finally let his gaze drop. He didn't look at my face. He didn't look at the way I'd done my hair or the jewelry I'd carefully chosen. His eyes locked onto my midsection, lingering on the soft curve of my stomach that the silk refused to hide. The silence stretched until it felt like it would snap. "You're actually going to wear that?" His voice was a low, dangerous crawl. There was no concern in it, only a jagged, cold venom. I tried to pull the fabric down, my hands shaking. "Tyler, it's just, the fit is a bit tight tonight. I thought maybe we could just go somewhere more casual. It's our anniversary, I just want to spend it with you." He let out a short, bark-like laugh that hit me harder than a physical blow. "Casual? Sarah, I booked a table at the finest steakhouse in the city. I'm expected to show up with a partner who reflects my success, not a woman who looks like she's wearing a tent from a circus." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing mine. "Look at yourself. You've let yourself go so far that I don't even recognize the girl I proposed to. Where is she?" Because the woman standing in front of me clearly has zero self-respect. "I've been struggling," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Work has been so stressful, and with my thyroid issues, it hasn't been easy to keep the weight off. I'm trying, Tyler. I promise I'm trying." He didn't soften. If anything, his expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Thyroid? Stress? Those are just labels for your lack of discipline. It's embarrassing, Sarah. My colleagues are going to be there tonight. Do you have any idea what it's like for me to walk into a room and feel the pity in their eyes because my girlfriend can't put down a fork?" I felt the first tear escape, a hot trail of salt sliding down my cheek. "You're ashamed of me?" "I'm ashamed of what you've become," he snapped, turning his back on me to grab his coat from the bed. "I'm going to that dinner alone. I refuse to sit across from you and pretend I'm proud to be there. Stay here. Eat whatever it is that's more important to you than our relationship. But don't expect me to come home and pretend everything is fine." He didn't look back. He didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. The sound of the front door slamming was so loud it felt like the walls of the apartment were collapsing inward. I stood there, trapped in that red silk cage, staring at a mirror that reflected a broken heart. For the first time, I wasn't crying because I was fat. I was crying because I had spent 3 years loving a man who only loved a silhouette. I reached behind my back, ripped the zipper down with a jagged sob, and let the dress fall to the floor in a heap of useless red fabric. He had left me in the dark, but in that silence, I finally started to see the monster for who he really was. I used to think my heart was the only thing Tyler broke that night, but looking at his laptop, I realized he'd been planning my replacement for months. Before I show you how I turned his audit into my blueprint for a new life, I have to ask, would you have stayed to find out why he did it, or vanished that same night? If you're rooting for the woman who finally stops apologizing for existing, hit that subscribe button. You aren't going to believe how I handled the moment we finally came face to face again. The silence in the apartment was heavier than any weight I had ever carried. It had been 7 days since the door slammed, yet Tyler's presence felt like a suffocating fog in every room. I moved through the hallway like a ghost, a shadow of the woman I used to be, haunting the spaces where we once shared a life. But there were no memories of laughter here, only the sharp, ringing echoes of his criticisms. Every time I stepped into the kitchen, the air felt cold. I could almost see him standing by the counter, his arms crossed, eyes tracking my every movement. I'd reach for a glass of water and hear his voice, crisp and cruel, asking if I really needed the extra calories or if I was just bored and weak. The refrigerator, once a mundane appliance, had become a monument to my shame. I found myself standing before it in the dark, the pale blue light washing over me, paralyzed by a hunger that had nothing to do with my stomach and everything to do with my starving heart. For a week, I lived on a cycle of numbing the pain with whatever was fast, cheap, and comforting. Cardboard pizza boxes and crumpled burger wrappers began to pile up on the coffee table like a shrine to my own self-destruction. I was eating to bury the sound of his voice, but the more I consumed, the louder he became in my head. On the 8th night, I sat at his mahogany desk, the one piece of furniture he'd left behind because it was too heavy to move in a hurry. His laptop sat there, closed and unassuming. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that looking for answers in the ruins of a toxic relationship was like searching for a diamond in a landfill. But my fingers moved of their own accord. He hadn't wiped the drive. He was so arrogant, so sure that I was too broken to ever look, that he'd left his digital life wide open. I found it buried 3 folders deep, disguised under a boring title, Project Growth. My heart skipped a beat, thinking perhaps it was work-related. Instead, I clicked into a nightmare. The first thing that popped up was a gallery of screenshots, dozens of fitness models with razor-sharp jawlines and stomachs so flat they looked concave. But as I scrolled down, the images changed. They became photos of me. They weren't the photos we took on vacation or at family dinners. They were candid, cruel shots he must have taken when I wasn't looking. Me sitting on the couch in my pajamas. Me reaching for a snack in the pantry. Me sleeping, my chin tucked, creating a soft fold he had circled in bright red digital ink. Beside these photos was a document titled The Sarah Audit. I opened it, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a list of pros and cons, but the pros section was a single, lonely paragraph about how I used to be marketable at his firm's parties. The cons section went on for 3 agonizing pages. He had documented my decline with the cold, detached precision of a scientist observing a failing experiment. He had noted the exact month I started gaining weight after my mother's funeral, calling my grief an excuse for gluttony. He had bulleted my stretch marks, the softening of my jaw, and the way my clothes fit, labeling each one as a failure of character or a loss of investment value. He hadn't been my partner, he had been my auditor. He had been tracking my worth like a falling stock price, waiting for the moment to sell. I sat there in the glow of the screen, the brutal words searing themselves into my brain. For years, I had apologized for my body, thinking I was the one failing him. I thought if I could just be disciplined enough or pretty enough, I could earn back the love he once showed me. But looking at that list, I realized there was no amount of weight loss that would have ever been enough. He didn't want a woman. He wanted a project he could control. He saw me as a broken appliance that was no longer performing to his specifications. I looked away from the laptop and caught my reflection in the darkened TV screen across the room. I was surrounded by the debris of my morning, the grease-stained boxes, and the wrappers of the comfort food I'd used to try and fill the void he left. In the dim light, I didn't see a failure. I saw a girl who had been under siege. I saw a woman who had been told she was worthless so many times that she started to believe it was true. The tears started then, But they weren't the hot, desperate tears of a woman who wanted her boyfriend back. They were cold and clear. I wasn't crying for Tyler. I was crying for the version of me that had stayed in that house and let a man circle her flaws in red ink. I was crying for the girl who thought her only value was how much space she took up in a room. I stood up, my legs feeling steady for the first time in months. I walked over to the coffee table and began gathering the trash. I shoved the pizza boxes and the wrappers into a heavy-duty bag, moving with a sudden, sharp purpose. I didn't do it because I was starting a diet. I didn't do it because I wanted to prove him wrong or make him regret leaving. I did it because I was done feeding the sadness. I hauled the bag to the chute in the hallway and listened to it thud all the way down to the basement. As I walked back into my apartment, the air felt different. The echoes of his voice were still there, but they were growing faint. I went back to the desk, highlighted Project Growth, and hit delete. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen until the folder vanished into nothingness. He had tried to document my end, but all he had really done was provide the evidence I needed to finally start my life without him. Would you like me to move on to the intense narrative for Script 3, where Sarah begins her physical and spiritual reclamation? The alarm clock would buzz at 5 in the morning, a time Tyler used to call the hour for the disciplined, as if he held a patent on the sunrise. But now, the early morning belonged to me. I would lace up my sneakers in the quiet blue light of dawn, feeling the cool air settle over my skin. Those first few weeks, my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. Every time I felt the urge to turn back, I would hear his voice sneering about lack of discipline, and I would use that poison as fuel. I wasn't running away from my body anymore. I was walking toward a version of myself he had tried to bury alive. Every step on the pavement felt like a deliberate strike against the memory of his insults. I watched the sun bleed over the city's skyline, painting the concrete in shades of gold and violet while the rest of the world was still dreaming. In those moments, I realized the transformation wasn't about the inches leaving my waist. It was about the heavy, suffocating fog lifting from my soul. The silence was no longer filled with his ghost. It was filled with the sound of my own rhythmic breathing and the steady beat of a heart that was finally learning to beat for itself. I eventually found my way to a local hiking trail, a rugged path that snaked through the hills on the edge of town. I joined a group of strangers there, people who didn't know about the Sarah audit or the red silk dress that had once been my cage. In this group, I wasn't the fat girlfriend who had been dumped at a gala. I was just Sarah. I was the woman who brought the best trail mix and the one who always had an extra bottle of water for someone in need. It was a surreal experience to stand at the summit of a trail, sweat dripping down my back, and have a man look me directly in the eyes while discussing the view. He wasn't glancing down at my hips to see if I'd cheated on my diet. He wasn't checking his watch to see if I was slowing him down. These people saw my face when I spoke. They heard my jokes and valued my perspective. For the first time in years, I wasn't a project or a failure of investment. I was a human being, vibrant and capable, standing on top of a world that Tyler told me I wasn't fit to inhabit. The physical change was undeniable, of course. My clothes hung differently, and the constant inflammation in my joints had faded. But the real weight loss was the invisible kind. I had dropped the heavy burden of his expectations. I had shed the thick skin of defense I'd built to survive his sarcasm. I felt light, not because of the scale, but because I had stopped carrying a man who hated me. The true test of this new lightness came on a mundane Tuesday at the grocery store. I was standing in the produce aisle, picking out a ripe pineapple, when I saw a familiar face near the organic greens. It was Chloe, Tyler's sister. She had been a silent witness to so many of his corrections over the years, usually looking away in awkward silence while he belittled me over dinner. I saw the exact moment she recognized me. She stopped dead in her tracks, her hand frozen on a bag of spinach. Her jaw literally dropped as her eyes traveled from my sneakers up to my face. I wasn't wearing a drop of makeup, my hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and I was wearing simple leggings. But I was glowing. It wasn't just the post-hike flush, it was the unmistakable radiance of a woman who finally liked the person she saw in the mirror. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice thick with genuine shock. Is that really you? My God, you look incredible. You're tiny. I felt a flash of the old Sarah wanting to shrink, to apologize, or to brag. But she vanished as quickly as she appeared. I just stood my ground, my posture relaxed, and my head held high. I feel good, Chloe, I said, and the simplicity of the truth felt like a victory. I feel like myself again. Chloe stepped closer, her expression shifting from shock to a strange, frantic sort of hope. She looked around as if checking to see if Tyler was lurking in the cereal aisle. You know, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Tyler has been asking about you. A lot. He's actually going through a really hard time lately. Work is stressful, and he seems so miserable. He told me the other day that he thinks he made a huge mistake with how things ended. I looked at her, and for a second, I waited for the old pang of longing or the spark of "I told you so" to ignite in my chest. But there was nothing. No anger, no hidden desire to hear his apology, just a vast, peaceful emptiness where he used to live. He wants to see you, Sarah, she continued, encouraged by my silence. He's been saying he missed the old you and seeing you like this. I think he'd want to try again. I didn't let her finish. I didn't need to hear the rest of the script he had likely coached her to deliver. I just smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes and stayed there. It wasn't a smirk of revenge, it was the smile of someone who had found the exit to a maze. Tell Tyler I hope he finds what he's looking for, I said softly, my voice steady and kind. But also tell him that I'm far too busy living the life he told me I wasn't good enough for. I don't have room in my world for anyone who only loves me when I'm small. I didn't wait for her response. I turned my cart and walked toward the checkout line, my steps light and purposeful. I could feel her eyes on my back, but for the first time, the gaze of a Tyler didn't make me want to hide. I walked out of that store into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than air. I had finally realized that the weight he wanted me to lose was never about my body. It was about the power he held over me. And as I drove away, I knew I had finally left that 180 pounds of toxic dead weight exactly where it belonged, in the past. The rain was drumming a steady, peaceful rhythm against the large glass pane of my favorite corner coffee shop. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray afternoon that used to make me want to hide under a blanket and disappear from the world. But today, I was sitting by the window, a steaming oat milk latte in my hand and a genuine glow on my face. My phone buzzed on the table, and I felt a smile tug at my lips. It was a text from Mark, a guy I'd been seeing for a few weeks. It was just a photo of a sunset he'd seen, with a caption that read, "This reminded me of you, beautiful and radiant." There was no mention of my weight, no critique of my outfit, just a simple, honest appreciation for who I was, even on my messy bun days. I was mid-laugh, typing back a witty reply, when the atmosphere in the booth suddenly shifted. The chair across from me scraped harshly against the floor, and a shadow fell over my table. I looked up, expecting a stranger looking for a seat in the crowded shop. Instead, I found myself staring into the eyes of the man who had systematically tried to dismantle my soul. It was Tyler. But it wasn't the polished, arrogant Tyler I remembered. He looked haggard. His expensive suit jacket was slightly wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. He sat down without an invitation, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. His eyes didn't meet mine at first. They did a slow, hungry sweep of my body, scanning my collarbones, my jawline, and the way my sweater draped over my shoulders. It wasn't the look of a man who missed a woman. It was the look of a collector who had realized he threw away a masterpiece. "Wow, Sarah," he whispered. His voice was thick with a desperate, greedy kind of admiration. He leaned forward, reaching across the table to touch my hand, his fingers twitching. "I knew you had it in you. I mean, look at you. You look incredible. You're exactly the woman I knew you could be." I pulled my hand back instinctively, tucking it into my lap as if his touch were made of acid. The heat of the coffee shop felt suddenly oppressive. I waited for the old familiar spike of fear or the desperate need to please him, but all I felt was a cold, clarifying sense of detachment. Tyler didn't seem to notice my recoil. He took a deep breath, A smug, self-satisfied smile creeping onto his face, the look of a teacher whose failing student had finally passed a test. I have to admit, he continued, his tone shifting into that condescending purr I knew so well. I knew that tough love would work. I knew if I pushed you hard enough, if I was honest about how much you'd let yourself go, you'd find the motivation to change. It was hard for me too, Sarah. Leaving you like that, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it for you. I did it so you could be this version of yourself. I stared at him, my heart hammering not with love, but with a profound, staggering realization. He actually believed it. He truly sat there thinking he was the hero of my story. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, his cruelty hadn't been abuse, it had been a gift. He thought he had sculpted me with his insults, that his disgust was the fire that forged my new confidence. He was taking credit for the tears I'd cried alone on the kitchen floor and the miles I'd walked while my lungs screamed for air. He started talking faster now, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to reclaim his territory. Listen, I was thinking we could grab dinner tonight. That steakhouse I liked, the one you couldn't fit into the booths at before? We could go there. We can start over, Sarah. Now that you're back to my standards, now that you've shown you have the discipline to be the woman I deserve, there's no reason we can't be the power couple we were meant to be. I've missed having you on my arm. I watched his mouth move, but the words started to sound like static. I looked at the man across from me, the man who once held the power to make or break my entire day with a single look, and I realized that the monster was actually quite small. He was a man who could only feel big by making others feel tiny. He was a man whose love was a transaction based on a dress size and a social image. The anger I expected to feel simply never arrived. You feel anger toward someone who has power over you. You feel anger toward an equal who betrays you. But as I looked at Tyler's desperate eyes and his pathetic attempt to claim my hard-won victory as his own, the only thing I felt was a deep, quiet sense of pity. I pitied a man so hollow that he couldn't see the beauty in a soul unless it was wrapped in a specific type of packaging. I pitied a man who thought tough love was a synonym for psychological warfare. I leaned back in the booth, the latte long since forgotten. I didn't interrupt him. I let him finish his pitch about our new beginning and his standards. I let him believe, for just a few more seconds, that he still had a seat at my table. Because I wanted him to see the exact moment he realized that the door he slammed 3 months ago hadn't just shut, it had been bricked over. Are you done, Tyler? I asked quietly. My voice didn't shake. It was the calmest I had ever sounded in his presence. He blinked, taken aback by the lack of excitement in my tone. Yeah. I mean, I thought you'd be happy. I'm here, aren't I? I'm giving us another chance. I looked at him. Really looked at him, and let a small, sad smile touch my lips. Not the smile of a girl who had won, but the smile of a woman who had finally woken up from a very long, very dark dream. I was no longer the girl in the red silk dress, and he was no longer the man who got to tell me who I was. As I watched Tyler shrink in the rearview mirror, I realized the most dangerous weight I ever carried wasn't on my body. It was the opinion of a man who never deserved a seat at my table. I'm sharing this because I know someone watching this is currently being told they aren't enough for someone they love. If this story felt like a sign you've been waiting for, leave a red heart in the comments and subscribe to join a community that chooses self-respect over toxic standards. The coffee shop had gone strangely quiet, the ambient hum of the espresso machine and the rainfall outside fading into the background. I could feel the weight of Tyler's gaze, that expectant, arrogant look of a man waiting for a thank you he didn't deserve. He sat there, chest puffed out, waiting for me to fall into his arms because I finally met his requirements. But the woman sitting across from him wasn't the broken girl he'd abandoned in her Spanx 3 months ago. He opened his mouth to shout, to throw one last insult, to find that one jagged word that would make me crumble. But I didn't give him the chance. I didn't need to hear his final verdict. I had already delivered mine. I simply turned my back on him. The act of walking away felt like shedding a physical skin. Every step toward the door was a pound of his toxic influence falling off my shoulders. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the rain. The air was biting and cold, the water drenching my hair and soaking through my light jacket in seconds. But as the rain hit my face, I didn't shiver. I felt alive. I felt clean. A soft, bubbling sound started in my chest and rose up until I was laughing out loud in the middle of the sidewalk. It was the sound of a woman who had finally found the key to her own cage. I headed straight toward the curb where a dark SUV was idling. As I approached, the door opened and Mark stepped out. He wasn't checking his watch, and he didn't look at me with a list of cons in his eyes. He was holding a massive black umbrella, a look of genuine concern and warmth on his face as he hurried toward me to shield me from the downpour. "You're soaked," he said, pulling me close and tucking a wet strand of hair behind my ear. He didn't ask if I'd stayed too long or if I'd messed up my progress. He just looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. "You okay? You look like you just won a marathon." "I did," I whispered, leaning into him. I finally finished the race. I climbed into the warmth of the car, and as we pulled away from the curb, I caught one last glimpse of the coffee shop window. Tyler was still sitting there, a solitary, bitter figure framed by the glass. He was clutching his cold coffee, staring at the empty chair where his trophy used to sit. He was left with his standards, his lists, and his hollow pride. I turned away from the window and looked forward at the road ahead. I had found someone who loved the soul inside the body, someone who saw the beauty in the struggle and the strength in the scars. Tyler had wanted me to be thin so he could be proud, but I had become strong so I could be free. As the wipers cleared the rain from the windshield, the path ahead was finally beautifully clear. Now, I want to hear from you. If you found a secret list of your flaws on your partner's computer, would you confront them immediately, or would you use that information to plan your silent exit like I did? Let's talk about it in the comments below.